It all started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. My wife had just returned home from work when we noticed a letter slipped under our door. It was from our homeowners association, HOA, and instantly made her blood boil. The letter demanded a $675 fine for what they called a violation of community rules. Now here's the kicker. The so-called violation was nothing more than my wife planting flowers in our own front yard. The HOA claimed they were not approved and that we had to remove them immediately or pay the fine. She refused, and that's when things escalated fast. Before we knew it, our doorbell rang, and outside stood a police officer. Yes, the HOA had called the cops over flowers in our yard. We had always tried to follow the HOA rules. They were notorious in our community for being strict, almost obsessively so, and most neighbors approached them with a mix of fear and caution. There were endless stories about residents being fined for leaving a trash can out a few hours too long, painting their doors the wrong shade of brown, or even trimming a hedge slightly outside the allowed shape. Living in such a community, we had always made an effort to stay within the lines. We figured that a little extra caution was better than risking confrontations or penalties. After all, most people accepted that this was the price of living in a well-maintained neighborhood, even if some of the rules seemed petty or arbitrary. But nothing could have prepared us for what happened that day. My wife had spent weeks planning her little garden project. She wanted to brighten up our front yard with a few colorful flower beds. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about creating a little oasis after a long day of work, a small corner of happiness that we could call our own. Before planting a single seed, she had carefully combed through the HOA guidelines. She double-checked every rule related to landscaping, color restrictions, and permitted plants. Everything she had read suggested that her plan was perfectly acceptable. She was confident that she was within her rights. When Karen, the HOA representative, whose reputation for being difficult was already known throughout the neighborhood, arrived at our door, my wife greeted her politely. Karen, with her tightly pinned hair and sharp suit, exuded a kind of authority that made it clear she was used to being obeyed without question. From the moment she stepped onto our porch, my wife could feel the tension in the air. This was not going to be a casual conversation. Karen wasted no time. She pulled out the HOA notice and, with a tone that was more accusation than explanation, declared that my wife owed a $675 fine. The reason? The flowers in our yard had allegedly violated the community's landscaping rules. Karen didn't bother to elaborate on the specific rule, instead repeating that the fine was non-negotiable and that failure to pay would result in further action. My wife, still calm and composed, tried to reason with her. She explained that she had checked the HOA guidelines before planting the flowers and that there was nothing prohibiting her specific choices. She even mentioned that several neighbors had similar flower arrangements without facing any fines. It was a simple, logical argument. If the community rules didn't forbid it, why should she be penalized? But Karen wouldn't hear it. She leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing, and said in a sharp, almost threatening tone, "You either pay, or we escalate this." There was no room for discussion. Her words made it clear that, in her mind, compliance was mandatory, and questioning the authority of the HOA was unacceptable. The message was unmistakable. Do what we say, or face consequences. We tried another tactic. My wife brought out her phone and showed Karen photos of our yard alongside photos of other yards in the neighborhood. Several neighbors had flowers arranged in nearly identical patterns, planted in similar beds, and yet they had never received any fines. The idea was to demonstrate that the HOA was applying its rules inconsistently. Perhaps seeing concrete examples would make Karen reconsider. But Karen refused to listen. She didn't acknowledge the photos, the logic, or the fairness of the situation. She simply repeated the fine, insisting that it had to be paid immediately, and that any resistance would only escalate the matter. She even mentioned, almost casually, that additional penalties could be imposed if we didn't comply, a statement that was equal parts intimidating and absurd. At this point, the situation started to feel surreal. We weren't dealing with a minor misunderstanding or a miscommunication. We were facing someone who genuinely believed that calling the police over a few flowers was a reasonable solution. The thought seemed ludicrous, yet there she was, standing on our porch, ready to make good on that threat. It was as if the rules themselves had become more important than common sense or basic human decency. The stress of the encounter began to weigh on us. My wife felt a mix of frustration, disbelief, and anger. She had tried to follow the rules, and now she was being punished for doing exactly what the rules allowed. Meanwhile, Karen seemed almost energized by the confrontation, as though the power to impose fines was a personal triumph. It became clear that this wasn't just about flowers, it was about control. The HOA, embodied by Karen, wasn't interested in fairness or neighborly relations. They were interested in enforcing authority at any cost. As the conversation dragged on, the tension escalated further. Every time my wife tried to explain or provide evidence supporting her case, Karen would interrupt, dismiss, or escalate her tone. It was exhausting, mentally draining, and emotionally charged. By now, we were not just defending flowers. We were defending our right to live peacefully in our own home without arbitrary threats looming over us. At one point, I stepped in to support my wife, hoping that a second voice might break through Karen's stubbornness. I pointed out that she had no legal authority to enforce fines directly through law enforcement, and that disputes of this nature were civil matters to be handled in court. Karen's reaction was telling. She looked momentarily taken aback, but then quickly regained her composure, insisting that she had every right to act as she was. Her confidence was unshaken, but it was clear that she had underestimated our resolve. Even after this, she threatened additional penalties, as if trying to scare us into submission. Her words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. The more she spoke, the more surreal the situation became. It was hard to believe that an adult, representing an organization in a modern community, could consider involving police over something as trivial as a flower bed. And yet, here we were, caught in a battle that should never have escalated beyond a polite conversation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of back and forth, Karen left, but not before making one last pointed remark about fines and enforcement. The air immediately felt lighter, but the emotional residue remained. We realized that the encounter had been about more than flowers. It was about asserting our rights, standing up to arbitrary authority, and refusing to be intimidated. In the days that followed, we reflected on what had happened. It was a wake-up call to how easily rules can be weaponized, how people in positions of minor authority can abuse their power, and how important it is to remain calm, informed, and resolute when facing unreasonable demands. It was a lesson in resilience, in advocacy, and in understanding that sometimes standing up for something as small as flowers is actually standing up for your dignity. By the end of the week, we had fully processed the encounter. The flowers remained vibrant and untouched, a symbol of our small victory over an unnecessary conflict. We knew that this wouldn't be the last time we faced someone like Karen in the HOA, but we also knew that we were now prepared. Knowledge, calmness, and persistence had turned a potentially humiliating situation into a story of empowerment. When the sheriff arrived, it felt like a scene straight out of a movie, but this was our real life. The sound of the patrol car pulling into our driveway made my heart race. My wife took a deep breath, composed herself, and walked to the door. She opened it with a calmness that masked the adrenaline rushing through her veins. Standing there was a middle-aged officer in uniform, badge gleaming in the sunlight, looking both professional and approachable. He nodded politely, introducing himself, and asked what had happened. My wife explained everything, from the beginning, in clear, precise terms. She described how Karen, the HOA representative, had issued a $675 fine for our flower beds, which were entirely compliant with the community rules. She recounted the back-and-forth confrontation, the threats of further penalties, and most absurdly, Karen's insistence that the police could be called to enforce this fine. Every word was measured, calm, and factual. No yelling, no exaggeration, just the truth. The sheriff listened attentively, taking in every detail with an expression that suggested he had heard similar stories before. But this one seemed to amuse him slightly. There was a pause after my wife finished, a moment heavy with anticipation. We expected the officer to deliver a stern warning, or worse, tell us that the HOA had authority we didn't fully understand. But then, instead of taking sides or demanding immediate payment, He leaned forward slightly and asked a single, game-changing question. "Ma'am, may I see the HOA's authority to enforce this fine?" The question hit Karen like a lightning bolt. Her confident posture faltered for the first time. She shuffled through her papers, clearly caught off guard. The HOA letter she had been waving like a sword of authority suddenly seemed flimsy in the eyes of law enforcement. She had no official order from a court, no legal documentation granting her the power to demand payment or involve the police. All she had was the HOA's letter, which, while intimidating to some, carried no real legal weight. The sheriff's tone was calm but firm. He explained, very clearly, that disputes over HOA fines are civil matters. This meant that the HOA could not, under any circumstances, compel payment through law enforcement. The police do not enforce HOA rules or fines. His words cut through Karen's bravado like a knife. It was as if the entire premise of her visit, her threats, her insistence, her attempt to intimidate us with authority, was suddenly null and void. Hearing this, a wave of shock and relief washed over us. We had been prepared for a confrontation, maybe even a minor legal battle, but we had never expected the police to essentially validate our side of the story so openly. Karen, meanwhile, was visibly unsettled. Her posture stiffened. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, the tension in the air was almost comical, a surreal mixture of absurdity and vindication. The sheriff continued, emphasizing that any attempt by the HOA to involve law enforcement over these fines could land them in trouble. He mentioned that repeated threats, intimidation, or attempts to coerce residents could be legally challenged. He even explained that HOA fines, if disputed, could be taken to small claims court, where the matter would be settled legally, not through intimidation or fear tactics. His calm professionalism underscored a lesson that was almost surreal in its clarity. The law protects residents from overreaching HOA behavior, even when the organization acts as if it is above the rules. Karen, now red-faced and flustered, tried to defend herself, mumbling something about rules and compliance. But the sheriff, polite yet firm, did not entertain her argument. He made it clear that the role of law enforcement is to protect citizens and uphold actual laws, not to enforce HOA regulations. The officer's presence and explanation completely flipped the script. What had started as an aggressive, one-sided confrontation suddenly became a situation where we had the upper hand. As we processed what had just happened, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and vindication filled the air. The thought that someone could call the police over a flower bed and genuinely believe it was appropriate seemed absurd, almost cartoonish. Yet here we were, standing in our front yard, having been validated by an actual sheriff. The HOA's attempt to intimidate us had backfired spectacularly. The sheriff even gave us practical advice. He suggested keeping detailed records of any future interactions with the HOA, including letters, emails, and conversations. This documentation could be critical if the HOA tried to escalate matters or pursue fines through small claims court. His guidance was clear. The law protects homeowners, but only if they are informed, organized, and prepared to assert their rights. After the sheriff left, the reality of the situation hit us fully. We had been facing a system designed to pressure residents into compliance through fear, yet the law was on our side all along. Karen's threats, her insistence, and her over-the-top behavior were powerless in the face of legal clarity. The fine, the intimidation, and even the presence of law enforcement on the HOA's side amounted to nothing without proper legal authority. The experience also left us reflecting on the psychology behind such confrontations. Karen had clearly believed in the authority of her position, so much that she thought even the police would enforce HOA rules. Her confidence was based not on law, but on fear. Fear that residents would pay without question, intimidated by the possibility of escalation. But when confronted with the law, that fear-based power structure collapsed entirely. For my wife, the moment was empowering. Standing calmly, explaining the situation clearly, and allowing the sheriff to assess the facts demonstrated that knowledge and composure are far more powerful than intimidation. It was a vivid reminder that understanding one's rights and staying calm under pressure can turn an overwhelming situation into a triumph. Even days later, we replayed the sheriff's words in our minds. They weren't just instructions. They were a statement of justice. The officer had made it clear that HOA overreaches limits, and that residents do not have to cower under arbitrary rules enforced with threats. It was a lesson in civil rights, in courage, and in the importance of knowing the law. Ultimately, the encounter reshaped our perception of HOAs, authority, and personal power. We realized that the law exists to protect citizens from coercion, and that calm, informed action can neutralize even the most aggressive threats. Karen may have thought she had power, but it was an illusion, dismantled completely by a simple, logical question from the sheriff. By the time we closed the door, our front yard felt like more than just a piece of property. It was a victory, a symbol that standing up for oneself, armed with knowledge and patience, could overcome absurd intimidation. The sheriff's visit didn't just stop a $675 fine. It reinforced a fundamental truth. No matter how confident someone seems in their authority, it's the law that ultimately governs, not fear. And as we watched Karen retreat, her confidence shaken, we couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. The flowers in our yard weren't just blooms anymore. They were a statement. A small but meaningful stand for fairness, for justice, and for the power of staying calm and informed in the face of unnecessary conflict. Feeling empowered by the sheriff's clarification, my wife stood her ground with a confidence I had rarely seen before. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. All the weeks of planning, the months of tending to our yard, and the anxiety from Karen's unreasonable threats had culminated in this moment. She looked Karen directly in the eyes and calmly said, "We will not be paying this fine. Any further attempts to intimidate or harass us will be met with legal action." Her voice was steady, firm, and unwavering. There was no trace of anger, only resolve. Karen blinked, clearly taken aback. Her usual sharp, commanding demeanor faltered for the first time. It was almost visible, like a mask slipping. She had approached our home with the confidence of someone who believed they wielded unquestionable power. She had been ready to lecture, threaten, and coerce us into paying the $675 fine without question. But the sheriff's words had changed everything. Suddenly, Karen's threats seemed hollow, her authority paper-thin. The air between us felt charged, a silent shift signaling that the balance of power had dramatically shifted. The realization that our calmness and knowledge of the law gave us real leverage was electrifying. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about respect, autonomy, and the understanding that we didn't have to bow to arbitrary authority. For years, many homeowners in the community had quietly paid fines without question, intimidated by letters, warnings, or the mere presence of the HOA representatives. My wife's stance, grounded in knowledge and principle, was a bold declaration that we would not be intimidated. Karen hesitated, her lips pressed tightly together as if she were weighing her options. The confidence she had wielded like a weapon for so long had cracked. Without legal authority, without a court order, she could do nothing more than retreat, or escalate to a civil action, which would take months or even years. Her silence spoke volumes. For the first time, the HOA's power, which had seemed so absolute, was exposed as fragile and contingent on adherence to proper legal procedures. The sheriff, noticing the shift in tension, politely offered guidance. He suggested that disputes like this are best handled civilly, and reminded both parties that law enforcement is not a tool for enforcing HOA fines. He reiterated that intimidation or threats could have serious legal consequences for the HOA. Then, with a courteous nod, he left, leaving behind a tangible sense of relief. His presence had been a reminder that the law protects ordinary citizens from overreach, and that standing up to intimidation does not make you difficult. It makes you informed and courageous. After the officer departed, we stood on our porch for a long moment, taking in what had just happened. The tension that had been coiled in our bodies slowly unwound. There was an almost surreal quality to it. The realization that an entire conflict that had loomed so large over our heads could be dismantled simply by asserting our rights calmly and clearly. It was a lesson in empowerment, a validation that knowledge and composure are often more powerful than anger or force. We also started thinking about the broader implications. How many other homeowners had faced similar intimidation from HOA? As it turned out, quite a few. We began talking to neighbors, discovering stories of petty fines, arbitrary rules, and harassment. Some have been fined hundreds of dollars for things as minor as leaving a trash can out for an extra day or planting flowers deemed unsanctioned. Many had quietly paid, believing there was no alternative. Others had faced repeated harassment, unsure how to challenge the HOA without getting drawn into long, stressful disputes. Our experience illuminated the overreach that some HOAs exercise when left unchecked. On paper, the HOA seemed powerful. They had letters, fines, rules, and an air of authority that could intimidate residents into compliance. In practice, however, without legal backing, all of that power was empty. Their enforcement mechanisms were limited, and their ability to coerce was only as strong as the fear they could instill. It became clear that many homeowners had been living under an illusion of HOA omnipotence, when in reality, a well-informed, calm, and assertive approach could neutralize their threats. For us, this experience became a turning point, not just in our relationship with the HOA, but in how we understood personal rights and community dynamics. We realized that the key to dealing with overreach is preparation and composure. We documented every interaction, kept copies of letters, and made sure we understood the legal landscape. By arming ourselves with knowledge, we could respond to future conflicts with confidence, rather than fear. There was also an unexpected emotional impact. Standing firm against Karen and witnessing the sheriff's validation gave us a profound sense of justice. It reinforced the idea that fairness is not about confrontation. It's about asserting one's rights thoughtfully, calmly, and strategically. The flowers in our yard, once a source of potential conflict, now symbolized more than aesthetic beauty. They represented autonomy, resilience, and courage in the face of arbitrary authority. Over the following weeks, we noticed subtle changes in the community. Our neighbors, having observed the confrontation from a distance, seemed inspired. Some admitted they had always feared challenging the HOA, but our stance sparked conversations about homeowners' rights and the limits of HOA authority. People shared their stories more openly, realized they weren't alone, and even discussed strategies for dealing with similar situations in the future. We also took time to reflect on our emotional journey. The stress, anxiety, and frustration we had experienced were significant, yet they were overshadowed by the empowerment that came from taking control of the situation. It taught us patience, strategic thinking, and the importance of measured responses. We realized that fear is often the greatest weapon in an HOA's arsenal, but fear can be neutralized with clarity, knowledge, and calmness. Standing up to Karen and the HOA also strengthened our partnership. We faced the situation as a team, supporting each other through the tension and uncertainty. My wife's calm determination and my support combined to create a united front that could not be easily shaken. It was a lesson in teamwork, trust, and mutual respect, one that extended far beyond the immediate conflict over flowers. In the end, the HOA did not pursue the fine further. Karen, for all her bluster, realized that without legal authority, her threats were meaningless. Our small victory sent a clear message. Arbitrary power can be challenged, intimidation can be resisted, and knowledge is a true equalizer. Looking back, we understood that this was about more than just a $675 fine or a few flower beds. It was about standing up for our rights, protecting our home, and refusing to be bullied. It was about showing that even when an organization seems powerful, its authority has limits. Most importantly, it was a reminder that calmness, preparation, and knowledge can turn fear into empowerment. And so, our flower beds remained untouched, vibrant and beautiful, a living testament to our courage. More than that, our story became a beacon for others in the community, a small but significant reminder that standing firm, calmly, legally, and confidently can make a world of difference. So, what did we learn from this wild experience? First and foremost, always take the time to carefully read and understand your HOA rules, but don't let threats intimidate you. Just because a letter arrives in your mailbox demanding a fine doesn't mean it is automatically enforceable. Many homeowners feel pressured to comply out of fear, assuming the HOA has more authority than it actually does. Knowledge of the rules is your first line of defense. By knowing exactly what is allowed and what isn't, you can confidently respond to any claims, rather than reacting emotionally or paying unnecessarily. Second, don't underestimate the power of law enforcement clarification. Police officers are there to enforce laws, not HOA rules. When the sheriff arrived at our door, it became immediately clear that an HOA cannot use the police as a tool to collect fines. They are civil matters, not criminal, and the officer's calm explanation was a turning point in our case. This was a powerful reminder that the law is on your side when intimidation tactics overstep their bounds. Finally, staying calm, respectful, and composed while asserting your rights is crucial. My wife could have reacted angrily, argued, or even paid out of fear, but by keeping her composure, she turned a potentially stressful confrontation into a clear victory. Calmness demonstrates confidence and credibility, which intimidation cannot overcome. Today, our flower beds are thriving, and the HOA hasn't bothered us since. This experience taught us a broader lesson. Standing your ground isn't just about flowers in a yard. It's about protecting your rights, asserting your autonomy, and proving that not even the most aggressive HOA Karen can intimidate you when you know the law and remain composed. It's a reminder that knowledge, calmness, and courage are the real tools for handling conflicts like these.